I wanted to start by saying that you can really see at least part of the literature and the people who I have been influenced by in my presentation here. The one person who you can't see who has been incredibly influential in my thinking about understanding what community is and how to approach community engaged work as a co-production of knowledge is Richa Nagar, who was on my dissertation committee at University of Minnesota, and I would really recommend her work for a whole host of reasons, but it's I think it's quite accessible, and she does use participatory theater, so for anyone who's interested in that, but she really writes a lot about sort of the meta issues around just the idea of community engagement and, who these communities are that we sort of throw about. So with the expectation that we know what community is. And that's kind of what I wanted to start off with here, is to ask what kind of expectations you have. Expectations that I often hear and certainly experienced and, grapple with. And all of these are cited with some examples that you can refer to. Of course, it's just, there are many, many more, but I give you some examples. One is the idea that community engaged research sort of solves the problems that are embedded in traditional research design. And I think I list that as an important sort of expectation that students have come in to methods classes with, because they've been very frustrated with a top-down, often quantitative approach, particularly when the student, and I'm thinking of a student in particular, identifies with a marginalized community and felt very much like their voice and their peers' voices were not being heard. And so approached participatory research, community engaged research, as a sort of solution. And while I appreciate that, and I think there is certainly an element to that, or a capacity for those, for involving community voices and that sort of thing, I also encourage folks to unpack that a little bit, because research is complicated. And I assume that if I were studying rocks, it would still be complicated. But when you bring in humans, it's just people's expectations, the people with whom you're working, even a researcher's expectation that community members might want to be involved for the whole process of the research project may or may not be accurate, right? People have busy lives and they may be very satisfied by coming in for an interview, but they don't want to necessarily read the full transcript that they provided, and however many months, or in my case, years, it takes to get that content back to them for approval. And so, yeah, I think there are just a number of pieces that are wrapped up in this idea of how a community engaged research might provide a certain solution. There is certainly an expectation that CERi is sprawling and messy compared to other forms of research design. And I think there is a certain element to truth of that, in that it tends to be much more iterative. And, anytime you're asking folks to participate in the design of a survey instrument, for example, or of just a research design, a set of outputs, something that could benefit the community, just asking the question, what might benefit these communities can invite a lot more time. And so I think, there is some truth to that, but I also want to suggest to you that any research design has the potential, unless you're working with, a set of data that has already been gathered, you're working with a very, I think of a quite, quantitative design, perhaps led by in say psychology or biological sciences or something like that. And I'm probably overstating the case, but there are examples, of course, of very linear and methodically organized agendas. But I have to say that I think that it is maybe not even the majority of cases, certainly not in my experience of the kinds of research designs that I've seen both students and colleagues undertake. And so to that point, I would say even within community engaged design, it will be incumbent on you to set the parameters and the boundaries that will enable you to get the thing done that you need to get done, and also then to be able to delegate, or as you're involving folks as co-researchers, encourage them to start in their own direction, so that you can do the degree program that you also are working on. The third point here, that CERi relies primarily on qualitative methods. I mean, I hope that the Stout article exploded that notion for those of you who hadn't read it before. And I suggested that as a reading because it has been the most influential piece for me for understanding how quantitative method can be intensely participatory and community-led. CERi is not scalable or generalizable is a common notion, and I think that I think there's lots of conversation one could have about whether you want it to be scalable or generalizable, because in a kind of case study method, it may not be appropriate. But I do know of work that is that sort of advocates in that direction, and I provide a citation from one of my colleagues, Peter Hall, who is referenced on the next slide. And then the last piece, I think, of the many expectations we could talk about is about being an insider is easier in CERi. That's an assumption. And some people would also argue that it's actually more difficult because, being within community may make people more reluctant to offer candid responses. So what I really encourage folks to do is to unpack that idea of what an insider is, what that means, likewise what an outsider is, and what kind of expectations we have around where we are located and how that could change throughout the process of the research project. So these are the citations for those slides. And again, I'm happy to send this to you if you don't have that access to this otherwise. So just a couple of pieces on implications, and I'm aware that I have under 3 minutes. I want to say just one point about how community engaged research might change our understanding of data, and using a couple of passages from the Stout article. These pieces, especially for me, speak to how we can think about data as as both, as Stouditz says in the column on the left, variable-centered and person-centered. And in this article, the focus on marginalia reminds us that there are lots of elements that can be brought into a design, even as it's happening, that can complement the data that we think we're gathering. One of the pieces that I referenced on the previous slide is another public science project, and it again, it uses surveys and a lot of different mixed methods approaches, but the community element of coming back to co-researchers and having conversations about the meaningfulness of different responses when the project had undertaken some preliminary survey, for example, and having a debate within the group about what counts, and deciding as a group what is going to count is a very valuable and meaningful exercise that can really flesh out even what we think we're designing from the outset. So this slide is from Rob Kitchen's book, and he, at the beginning of this book, tries to unpack the term data, what we understand it to be. And so the right column is a more sort of top-down approach. Data are simply data. They're essential elements. They've been extracted. They don't have an inherent meaning. They are pre-analytical, pre-factual. And Kitchen argues against this, and through his conversation, data ends up looking more like what's on the left, like an assemblage. It's located in all the different ways. So I think that it's even more, I think, located when it is understood and sort of interpreted by co-researchers. Okay, and so I'll just end on the last couple of pieces that I wanted to raise, which is what I raised earlier, next to the owl, symbol for wise academia, whatever, that as Stout writes, relationships and political engagement is what we're going for here, not distance and neutrality, but we research in community, and that part of that community is a disciplinary community or interdisciplinary program with supervisors, with committee members. And so we have to be, also aware of the how we need to be pragmatic about our decisions, and how those decisions need to be in conversation with the things that we need to get done as part of a degree program. And then the last point about short-term and long-term implications, I think in the short term and the long term, perhaps, I think it's important to think about and unpack for yourselves an understanding of what friendship means in research relationships, because that is, part of the, potentially part of the community engaged research program. And Stuart, in our conversations in preparation for this, raised the important point that sometimes, because of community involvement, the community involvement actually makes the community a more attractive place to be. And so it sort of sets more conditions, perhaps, or makes sites more ripe for gentrification. And so I think it's important to think about, I think that is like a whole other semester-long conversation at least, but I do think it's useful and important to think about the ways in which advocacy and encouraging political activism needs to, and community solutions needs to be very much in conversation with maybe other community activism around how people are advocating at the municipal level and things to protect communities from displacement, for example. I just have two more things to say, and that is in that first reference from the Public Science Project, the authors argue that community-engaged research is not a methodology. Actually, it's an epistemology. It's a theory of knowledge, and it's, for them, a different understanding of knowledge production. And so I want to pose this as a question for you to think about. And then the last slide is this. Hear the, that's okay. Hear the waves. Again, my silly, what comes up as fun PowerPoint options with a quote that I heard, and the person who I heard it from, which now I can't even remember, they could not attribute it, so I don't have an attribution here, but I found it very compelling and certainly relevant in thinking about community-engaged research, which is change happens at the speed of trust. And trust, as we all know, takes a long time to establish. And so, you know, back to that, you have to get your project done. I think it's also part of that trust building exercise can be setting appropriate boundaries for yourselves and for what the project might look like. And that might be a smaller piece of a much bigger program that you are involved in the community. And that I think that is a useful exercise. And I mean, it's not something that you should be embarrassed about or perceive that as a problem, I guess.